Hey guys, tonight we're going back to the Middle Ages to explore a claim that sounds completely ridiculous at first. The average medieval peasant may, in some respects, have had a better work-life balance than many of us do today. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning without an alarm. Not because you finally achieved financial independence, but because it is the year 1300, and nobody has yet invented a small electronic rectangle capable of ruining your morning before your eyes are fully open. Instead, daylight creeps through the gaps around your shutters. Somewhere outside, a rooster begins screaming with the confidence of an animal that has never worked a day in its life. You climb from a straw-filled mattress, pull on your clothes, and begin your day. Already, your relationship with work is very different from the one you know today. You don't immediately check emails. There are no notifications beside your bed, no calendar announcing 3 meetings that could have been letters, and nobody has sent you a message at 11:30 the previous evening saying, "Quick question." Your problems are considerably more medieval. Animals need feeding, water needs carrying, the fire needs tending. Depending on the season, you might soon be walking toward the fields to plough, sow, weed, cut hay, or harvest crops. And make no mistake, this is hard physical work. Your back probably isn't particularly interested in hearing about medieval work-life balance, but your workday isn't completely separated from ordinary life. You work alongside relatives, neighbours, and other members of your household. You talk while performing repetitive tasks. You stop for meals. You move between agricultural work and domestic responsibilities. Your commute is particularly impressive. You walk outside, no traffic, no crowded train, no 45-minute journey to sit in front of a computer where you will eventually attend a video meeting with someone sitting 12 meters away. More importantly, nature controls your schedule. During harvest, you might work from sunrise until darkness, because losing crops could mean actual hunger. But during quieter periods, particularly parts of winter, agricultural activity slows considerably. Compare that with your own year. You might work roughly the same schedule in January, April, July and November. The sun can rise late, disappear early, and generally make it very clear that humans should probably be sleeping. Your calendar remains unmoved. Then evening arrives. For you, finishing work might simply mean moving from the large screen to the medium screen, while occasionally checking the small screen. For the medieval peasant, darkness creates a genuine boundary. There is no laptop waiting on the kitchen table, no inbox quietly multiplying, no manager wondering why you haven't replied. You eat, you talk, perhaps you drink some ale. Eventually you climb into bed. Tomorrow brings another day of physical labour, but tonight nobody can contact you. And somewhere beneath your medieval blanket, you enjoy something surprisingly difficult to find 800 years later, being completely offline. Now that you've survived your first imaginary day as a medieval peasant, you may notice something missing from your house. A clock. Today, your life is practically ruled by numbers on a screen. You wake at 7. You need to leave at 8:15. Work begins at 9. Lunch lasts 30 minutes. Your meeting starts at 2:30. And if you arrive somewhere 7 minutes late, apparently civilization begins collapsing. For a medieval peasant, time works differently. You certainly understand morning, midday, afternoon and evening, but you don't necessarily organise every activity around precise minutes. In rural communities, daylight, church bells, meals, weather, and the progress of particular tasks are often more important. Your most obvious clock is hanging directly above you, the sun. When daylight arrives, activity begins. When the sun climbs high, you know roughly where you are in the day. When darkness approaches, outdoor work becomes considerably less practical. This creates a working rhythm that feels strange from a modern perspective. Imagine your employer telling you, "Come in when the light is good, and leave when you can no longer see the wheat." Human resources would need some adjustments. Church bells provide another important structure. Bells can announce religious services and mark significant moments during the day, giving communities shared reference points without everyone carrying their own personal timepiece. But you still aren't constantly measuring productivity minute by minute. If you're ploughing a field, the important question isn't whether you've completed exactly 8 hours. The important question is whether the field has been ploughed. And this difference matters. Today, you can finish everything important by 3 in the afternoon and still remain at your desk until 5, because those are your contracted hours. You may spend the final 40 minutes moving your mouse occasionally, while developing an intense professional interest in the weather forecast. Your medieval counterpart has different pressures. During harvest, daylight can mean working brutally long hours. If rain is coming and grain needs gathering, nobody announces that you've reached your daily limit. But when agricultural demand falls, the opposite can happen. Your workload follows the task and the season, rather than remaining identical throughout the year. Modern technology eventually freed you from daylight. Electric lighting allows you to work after sunset. Computers allow you to work from almost anywhere. Smartphones allow work to reach you while you're supposedly relaxing. Humanity spent centuries defeating darkness, and then used the victory to answer emails at 10:30 at night. For the medieval peasant, sunset still has authority. When darkness arrives, the working world naturally begins shrinking. Your day isn't necessarily easier, but at least the sun knows when to clock out. Once you stop measuring your medieval life by hours, another difference becomes obvious. Your workload changes dramatically depending on the season. Today your boss probably doesn't walk into the office in December and announce, "Well, the soil is frozen. See everyone in March." Unfortunate, really. For you, January can look remarkably similar to July. You wake up, commute, work, answer messages, attend meetings, and repeat. Modern offices have heating, lighting, electricity, and internet connections, meaning nature has lost much of its ability to tell you when you should stop working. As a medieval peasant, nature is effectively your manager, and she has absolutely no interest in quarterly targets. Spring arrives, and your workload increases. Fields need preparing. Soil must be ploughed. Seeds need sowing. Animals require attention. Repairs delayed during winter suddenly become important. Then summer arrives. Now you're maintaining crops, cutting hay, tending animals, repairing fences, gathering resources, and preparing for the most demanding period of your agricultural year. Autumn brings harvest. This is medieval crunch time. If the grain is ready, you cannot tell it you'll deal with it Monday. A few days of terrible weather could damage months of work, so you and everyone around you may spend extremely long days cutting, gathering, carrying, threshing, and storing crops. Your work-life balance temporarily becomes mostly work, but then something happens that modern working life rarely allows. The intense period ends. As autumn disappears into winter, the agricultural calendar slows. You certainly don't become unemployed for several months. Animals still need feeding. Firewood must be gathered. Tools need repairing. Food needs preparing. Clothes need mending. Household work continues. But there is simply less field work available. The days themselves become shorter. And because your society cannot illuminate an entire office building until midnight, darkness still has considerable negotiating power. Compare this with your modern schedule. You have air conditioning when summer becomes hot, heating when winter becomes cold, artificial light when darkness arrives. Your laptop works during thunderstorms, winter evenings, and unfortunately, even beautiful sunny afternoons when you would much rather be somewhere else. Technology removed many seasonal restrictions from work. That made modern economies extraordinarily productive, but it also removed many natural pauses. Your medieval year moves in waves, periods of exhausting labour followed by slower periods of recovery and maintenance. Your modern year can feel more like one continuous line. Monday becomes Friday. Friday becomes Monday. January somehow becomes August. And suddenly someone asks whether you've started thinking about Christmas. The medieval peasant doesn't have an easier working life, but he does have something you may recognise surprisingly little: a genuine off-season. So far, your medieval working year might sound suspiciously pleasant. You work according to daylight. Your schedule changes with the seasons. Winter eventually brings a slower rhythm. Then harvest arrives and destroys your new medieval lifestyle fantasy. For a farming household, harvest is one of the most important periods of the entire year. The grain standing in the fields represents months of labour and, more importantly, much of the food that will help keep your household alive. You cannot simply harvest whenever convenient. Once crops are ready, time matters. Bad weather can damage them. Grain can spoil. Animals can interfere. Every delay increases the possibility that part of your food supply disappears. So you wake early, very early. You head into the fields while the morning is still cool and begin cutting grain using hand tools. There are no combine harvesters quietly doing the work while you sit inside an air-conditioned cabin listening to a podcast. You are the combine harvester. Unfortunately, nobody installed air conditioning. You bend, cut, gather, lift, carry, and repeat. Other members of your household work alongside you. Depending on local arrangements, neighbours may cooperate, while labourers can be hired when additional hands are desperately needed. Meals interrupt the work, but daylight is precious. You keep going. And compared with your modern working life, harvest reveals something important about medieval work-life balance. It isn't necessarily about working fewer hours every day. Sometimes you work far more intensely than you would today. Imagine your busiest week at work, except instead of answering 47 emails, you are racing against a thunderstorm that could damage your winter food supply. Suddenly that Monday morning spreadsheet feels almost affectionate. But there is one crucial difference. Your medieval period of extreme work has a visible ending. The field eventually becomes empty. The grain is gathered. The harvest finishes. Modern work often doesn't provide that same psychological conclusion. You finish one project and another appears. You clear your inbox and 6 new messages arrive. You reach Friday only to discover that Monday has been patiently waiting for you. The medieval harvest is exhausting because the workload becomes temporarily enormous. Modern work can be exhausting because it never completely disappears. Once the crops are safely stored, however, your pace can begin changing again. The days grow shorter. Temperatures fall, fields become quieter. You have survived the most demanding part of the agricultural calendar. And slowly, medieval nature begins doing something your modern employer probably won't. It starts reducing your workload. After weeks of exhausting harvest work, the medieval year begins to change around you. The fields become quieter. The days become shorter. Temperatures fall. rain turns colder, and eventually frost can make agricultural work difficult or impossible. For once, nature has effectively sent you an email saying, "We're going to circle back in spring." And unlike your actual emails, this one is good news. Winter does not mean that you simply climb into bed in November and emerge several months later. You still have plenty to do. Animals need feeding and cleaning. Firewood must be gathered. Buildings require repairs. Tools damaged during the farming season need attention. Inside your home, work continues as well. Food must be prepared and preserved. Clothing needs mending. Wool can be spun. Household objects are repaired or produced. Depending on your family, occupation, and region, you might spend significant time on craft work that supplements agricultural income. For women especially, domestic labour does not conveniently disappear because the wheat has stopped growing. But compared with harvest season, the rhythm is different. Your working world becomes smaller. Short winter days naturally limit outdoor activity. Once darkness arrives, continuing certain tasks becomes more difficult. Candles and lamps exist, of course, but lighting an entire building throughout the evening isn't something your household can casually do. Compare that with your life today. December arrives. It gets dark before dinner. Your body notices this and quietly suggests that perhaps you should slow down. Modern society responds by turning on several thousand fluorescent lights and informing you that the quarterly report is due Thursday. Winter barely matters to your working schedule. You can answer emails at midnight in January with exactly the same efficiency as you can at midday in June. Progress. For your medieval counterpart, however, winter creates a genuine seasonal slowdown. More time can be spent indoors with family and neighbours. Religious celebrations punctuate the cold months. Meals, storytelling, drinking, games, repairs, and communal gatherings become important parts of everyday life. This should not be romanticised. Winter could be dangerous. Food supplies might run low. Houses could be painfully cold. Illness could become serious very quickly. You might occasionally find yourself longing for central heating rather than improved work-life balance. Still, there is something striking about the rhythm. You worked intensely when nature demanded it. Now nature is forcing you to slow down. Today, we have largely conquered that limitation. And somehow, after inventing electricity, central heating, computers, and instant communication, we use them to create the revolutionary ability to work all year. The medieval peasant would probably be impressed. For about 5 minutes. After spending your medieval week repairing tools, tending animals, working fields, carrying water, and discovering muscles you didn't know existed, Sunday finally arrives. And Sunday is different. In medieval Christian Europe, Sunday is supposed to be devoted to worship and rest. The Church repeatedly discouraged ordinary labour on the Sabbath, meaning that for many people, the weekly calendar contains something modern workers sometimes struggle to protect. A day when you're actually expected not to work. You wake in the morning knowing that the usual rhythm has been interrupted. Essential tasks don't magically disappear. Animals remain completely uninterested in Christian theology and still expect breakfast. Food needs preparing. Fires need tending. Emergencies happen. But ordinary agricultural work can pause. Instead, you might attend Mass at your local church. And the church is much more than somewhere you quietly sit for an hour before returning home. It is one of the centres of your community. You see neighbours. You hear announcements. You exchange news and gossip. You learn who is getting married, who has died, who owes somebody money, and whose cow has somehow entered somebody else's field again. Essentially, medieval social media, just with fewer strangers arguing underneath everything. After religious obligations, Sunday can become a period for eating, drinking, visiting relatives, talking with neighbours, playing games, or simply recovering from physical labour. Now compare this with your Sunday. You technically have the day off. Then you check your phone. There's an email. You tell yourself you won't answer it. Then you read it. Then you think about the answer. Then you answer it because it'll only take 2 minutes. 25 minutes later, you're sitting on the sofa looking through a document you absolutely promised yourself you wouldn't open until Monday. Your medieval counterpart doesn't have this problem. If the manor steward wants something from you, he has to physically find you. A powerful productivity feature called distance. Of course, medieval Sundays were not universally relaxing, and rules varied across centuries, regions, occupations, and communities. Agricultural necessity could override ideal religious schedules, but the principle remains important. Rest wasn't merely something you squeezed into whatever time remained after work. It was built into the religious structure of the week, and Sunday wasn't the only interruption, because medieval Christianity filled the calendar with saints, holy days, festivals and celebrations, which means that just as you begin wondering how many days medieval people actually spent away from ordinary labour, you discover something remarkable. The medieval calendar was absolutely covered in holidays. Sunday isn't the only time your medieval routine gets interrupted, because if you're living in Christian medieval Europe, your calendar is crowded with religious celebrations. Saints' days, major Christian festivals, local feast days and other holy occasions appear throughout the year. Exactly how many involve reduced or prohibited work depends heavily on where and when you live, so there is no universal medieval vacation calendar. Still, religious observance regularly breaks up the working year. And compared with your modern schedule, this creates an interesting difference. Today you probably have a relatively predictable collection of holidays. You know roughly when they are coming, and depending on your job, you may spend the week before them attempting to complete twice the normal amount of work so you can properly enjoy your time off while thinking about work. Very efficient. In your medieval village, however, religious festivals are woven directly into community life. Christmas is important, obviously. Easter is even more central to the Christian calendar. Then there are celebrations connected with saints, the Virgin Mary, apostles, and local religious traditions. Your village church may have its own patron saint. That means another celebration. Apparently heaven had a surprisingly generous holiday department. On important feast days, ordinary routines can slow or stop. You attend religious services, but the day may also involve communal meals, drinking, music, games, processions, markets, and visiting neighbours. The boundary between religion and leisure is far less obvious than you might expect. For you, these aren't simply days off. They're part of how you understand the year itself. Instead of remembering months through project deadlines, meetings, and quarterly targets, you associate periods with agricultural work and religious celebrations. You know when planting begins. You know when harvest approaches. You know when particular feast days arrive. Your year has rhythm. Modern life has largely replaced this with another sacred calendar. Monday morning, Friday afternoon, payday, and the mysterious meeting scheduled for Wednesday at 3, with absolutely no description attached. Of course, you shouldn't imagine medieval peasants enjoying endless holidays. Animals still require care. Food still needs preparing. Necessary work continues, and religious rules aren't followed identically everywhere. But frequent communal celebrations create something modern working culture can easily lose: socially recognized permission to stop. You aren't secretly checking whether your colleagues are still working. Everyone around you is celebrating too. And once the religious obligations are finished, you have another problem to solve. What exactly do you do with your free time? Fortunately, medieval people were surprisingly good at finding answers. So you've made it through the working week, attended church, and discovered that today happens to be another feast day. For perhaps the first time in this experiment, you have something resembling free time. Now what? You cannot watch Netflix. You cannot scroll through social media. And unfortunately, nobody has invented the highly sophisticated modern hobby of spending 40 minutes deciding what to watch before going to bed instead. But medieval people certainly know how to entertain themselves. If you live in a village, much of your leisure is social. You visit neighbours, gather around fires, tell stories, sing songs, dance, drink ale, and play games. Depending on where you live, you might encounter wrestling, archery contests, ball games, dice, board games, or seasonal competitions. Fairs and festivals provide even greater excitement. A local fair can bring merchants, performers, musicians, food, animals, travellers, and goods you rarely encounter during ordinary village life. For you, this isn't simply shopping, it's entertainment. Imagine combining a shopping centre, festival, pub, sporting event, and neighbourhood gossip session into one place. Then add livestock. Medieval people also spend enormous amounts of time talking. This sounds obvious until you compare it with your own leisure. You finish work today, return home, and perhaps spend several hours looking at screens. You watch television while checking your phone. You send messages to friends who live 15 minutes away. You consume entertainment produced by people thousands of kilometres from you. You are connected to almost everyone, yet you can spend an entire evening physically alone. Your medieval counterpart has almost the opposite problem. Privacy is extremely limited. If you want entertainment, other human beings are usually involved. Your neighbours know your family, your arguments, your embarrassing moments, and probably several things about you that you would strongly prefer they didn't. There is no anonymous browsing in a village of 200 people. But leisure is naturally communal. Even evenings at home can involve storytelling, singing, simple games, conversation, or shared household activities. Of course, free time isn't evenly distributed. Your wealth, gender, occupation, season, and family responsibilities all affect how much leisure you actually have. Still, when ordinary labour pauses, entertainment doesn't require you to remain connected to work. Nobody interrupts your village dance because your manager has updated a spreadsheet. Nobody sends a notification during the storytelling. And nobody asks you to join a quick Zoom call. Instead, when you want news, conversation, alcohol, entertainment, and questionable opinions all in one convenient location, medieval society already has the perfect invention. You go to the tavern. After a long day of medieval labour, you finally decide you've earned a drink. Fortunately, medieval Europe has you covered. You head toward the local alehouse or tavern, one of the closest things your village has to a social network, restaurant, newsfeed, business centre, and occasionally boxing ring, all conveniently located under one roof. For many ordinary people, drinking establishments are important social spaces. Depending on your location and period, you might find alehouses serving locally brewed ale, inns accommodating travellers, or taverns selling wine and other drinks. You enter and immediately encounter something modern life often separates from work: your community. The person drinking beside you might have spent the morning helping with a neighbouring field. Another person knows your family. Someone has news from a nearby market. A traveller may bring stories about events beyond the village. There is gossip. A lot of gossip. Human beings apparently managed to invent that several thousand years before they invented comment sections. You drink ale, eat if food is available, play dice or another simple game, tell stories, complain about local problems, and exchange information. And importantly, you're actually present. Compare this with your evening today. You finish work and perhaps stop at a bar with colleagues. Then your phone vibrates. You check it. A work message. You put the phone away. 30 seconds later, it vibrates again. Now you're sitting with friends while mentally composing tomorrow morning's reply to someone who apparently believes 7:43 in the evening is an appropriate time to discuss a spreadsheet. Your medieval tavern has no Wi-Fi. For perhaps the first time in history, this is an advantage. Of course, medieval drinking culture has its own problems. Arguments happen. Gambling can become expensive. People drink too much. Authorities periodically worry about disorderly alehouses. Apparently, putting several tired humans in a room with alcohol produced exactly the same results 800 years ago. But the tavern represents something larger about medieval leisure. Work and social life exist close together geographically, yet there can still be a surprisingly strong practical boundary between them. Once the day's agricultural tasks are finished, your employer has very limited ability to follow you into your evening. There is no digital connection keeping you permanently available. You can simply disappear into the local alehouse, and when you look around the room, you notice something else. Almost everyone you know is here. Because medieval leisure isn't simply about having time away from work. It's about spending that time together. And that sense of community changes the meaning of free time entirely. After a few evenings in your medieval village, something starts becoming obvious. You are almost never truly alone. Today, that might sound either comforting or absolutely horrifying, depending on how much you like your neighbours. But medieval village life is built around community in a way that feels increasingly unfamiliar to you. You work alongside relatives and neighbours. You attend church together. You gather at markets and fairs. You celebrate weddings and feast days together. You drink together. When an important agricultural task requires additional hands, people may cooperate. Your social life isn't something you carefully schedule 3 weeks in advance. You don't send your neighbour a message asking whether he's free for ale sometime next month. You walk over. This is partly because medieval communities are small and geographically concentrated. The people you work beside are often the same people you encounter during your leisure time. That creates disadvantages. Privacy, for example, is not exactly thriving. If you embarrass yourself at the alehouse on Saturday evening, there is an excellent chance the person working beside you on Monday already knows, probably because he was there. But there is another side to this arrangement. Your leisure happens naturally around other people. Compare that with your life today. You might commute to work alone, spend 8 hours interacting professionally, commute home, order dinner through an app, watch entertainment alone, and communicate with friends through a screen. You can theoretically contact almost anyone on Earth. Yet arranging dinner with 4 friends can require the logistical planning of a minor military campaign. Your medieval counterpart has fewer connections, but those connections are physically close, and work itself can become social. Imagine spending hours harvesting alongside people you have known your entire life. The labour remains exhausting, but conversation, jokes, songs, gossip, and shared meals become part of the working day. Modern employment often separates these categories much more clearly. Work happens here. Friends are somewhere else. Family is at home. Entertainment comes through another device. The medieval village compresses them together. That doesn't automatically make medieval life happier. Small communities can be restrictive, judgmental, and extremely difficult to escape. But they create fewer barriers between everyday life and social interaction. You don't necessarily need to make time for your community. Your community is already there. And that distinction matters when discussing work-life balance. Because having free hours means relatively little if you're too exhausted or isolated to enjoy them. Still, before you become too jealous of your medieval counterpart, there is one enormous complication. So far, we've talked about the medieval peasant as though everyone experiences work equally. They absolutely do not. And if you're a medieval woman, the idea that work conveniently ends at sunset becomes considerably more complicated. So far, your medieval work-life balance has sounded surprisingly manageable. You work hard, certainly, but the sun eventually sets. Winter slows agricultural labour. Feast days interrupt the calendar, and Sundays provide periods of rest. There is, however, one small problem. You have mostly been imagining yourself as a man. If you're a medieval peasant woman, the phrase, "the working day is over," becomes considerably more theoretical. You may work in the fields alongside men, particularly during demanding periods such as planting and harvest. You can tend livestock, milk animals, maintain gardens, gather fuel, carry water, sell produce, or participate in whatever economic activities help keep your household alive. Then you return home, and congratulations. Your second shift begins. Food needs preparing, clothing needs washing and repairing, children require care, fires must be maintained, grain may need processing, wool can require spinning, and depending on your household, brewing ale or producing goods for sale might also become part of your responsibilities. Your medieval smartwatch would probably describe the day as excessive. Except you don't have a smartwatch. You have a bucket. This makes comparisons with modern life particularly interesting, because one problem has survived remarkably well across the centuries: unpaid domestic labour. Today, you might finish 8 hours at a paid job, return home, and immediately begin cooking, cleaning, shopping, caring for children, or organising the household. The technology has improved dramatically. You have washing machines, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, running water, supermarkets, and ovens that don't require you to maintain an actual fire. Yet the basic problem remains familiar. Being home does not necessarily mean being off work. For a medieval woman, this distinction is even less clear because the household itself is an economic unit. Home isn't simply where you relax after work. Home is where an enormous amount of work happens, and seasonal slowdowns don't eliminate everything. Winter may reduce field labour, but meals still need cooking. Animals remain stubbornly alive. Children continue requiring attention despite showing absolutely no respect for agricultural calendars. So when we say medieval peasants sometimes enjoyed more breaks than modern workers, you need to be careful. Not every peasant experiences those breaks equally. Gender, wealth, family size, occupation, legal status, and local customs all shape how much genuine leisure you have. And there is another complication. Even if you're a male peasant enjoying a quiet Sunday afternoon, you are not exactly your own boss, because somewhere nearby stands a manor. And the person who owns it may have some very specific ideas about how much of your labour belongs to him. Now that you've discovered medieval life comes with plenty of work, there is another detail that might make you feel strangely at home. Someone else wants part of what you earn. Some things really are timeless. Depending on where and when you live, you might be a free tenant, a serf, or belong to another category of rural worker. Medieval society is far too complicated for every peasant to fit neatly into one box. But if you're tied to a manor, your relationship with work isn't simply about feeding your family. You have obligations. Perhaps you owe rent. Perhaps you must provide agricultural produce. Perhaps you're required to spend certain days working land controlled directly by your lord, which means you can wake up, Look at your own field that desperately needs attention and discover that today you're working on somebody else's. Think of it as medieval unpaid overtime, except instead of your manager saying, "We're all a family here, there's a fortified house overlooking the village," and refusing may have considerably worse consequences than an awkward performance review. You might plough the Lord's fields, help with harvesting, repair fences, transport goods, or perform other required services. The exact obligations vary enormously between estates and periods, but the basic principle is familiar. Not all of your working time belongs entirely to you. Then there are other demands. You may owe payments or dues connected with landholding. Certain facilities could involve additional charges. Local customs might determine what you owe when inheriting property or using particular resources. Your medieval financial life can become surprisingly complicated for someone who doesn't even have online banking. Compare this with your modern paycheck. You work your contracted hours, taxes are deducted, rent or mortgage payments arrive, utilities need paying, insurance appears, subscriptions quietly reproduce in the background, and eventually you look at what remains. Your medieval counterpart would understand the general emotion. The systems are obviously very different. Modern taxation supports institutions and public services that medieval peasants could scarcely imagine, while feudal and manorial obligations existed within radically unequal political structures. Still, psychologically, there is a recognizable frustration. You perform labor. Someone else claims a portion of its value. And this is why romanticizing medieval work-life balance would be a mistake. You might enjoy seasonal slowdowns and genuine separation from work after sunset, but you have far less economic freedom and security than most modern workers. Yet even this medieval system has not fully introduced the thing that will eventually transform working life. The clock. Because once employers can measure not simply what you produce, but exactly how many hours and minutes you spend producing it, work is about to change forever. Up to this point, your medieval working life has been controlled mainly by things you can actually see. The sun rises, you work, the sun sets, you stop. Simple. Then Europeans begin becoming increasingly interested in measuring time more precisely, and everything starts getting considerably less relaxing. Mechanical clocks begin appearing in European towns during the late Middle Ages. At first, these are not little devices sitting beside your bed. They are enormous mechanisms installed in churches, towers, and public buildings. You don't own the clock. The entire town does, and gradually, bells can divide your day into increasingly recognizable units. This sounds wonderfully convenient. Unfortunately, humans have a remarkable ability to turn convenient inventions into new ways of telling you that you're late. For an agricultural worker, nature still matters enormously. You cannot convince wheat to grow faster because your calendar says harvest is approaching. But in towns, workshops, markets, and commercial environments, precise time becomes increasingly useful. Activities can begin at agreed hours. Meetings can happen more predictably. Working periods can be measured. And slowly, an important change begins. Time itself acquires greater economic value. Compare that with your life today. You don't merely sell what you produce. Very often you sell blocks of your time. 8 hours. 40 hours per week. Perhaps you're paid by the hour, or perhaps you're salaried but still expected to appear at a particular time and remain available until another particular time. You can finish your work early and still not technically be finished. Your medieval farmer would find this slightly confusing. If you've finished repairing the fence, why are you still standing beside the fence? Because your shift ends at 5. Naturally. Modern life takes time measurement even further. Your phone records screen time. Your smartwatch measures sleep. Apps track productivity. calendars divide your day into coloured rectangles. You can schedule 15 minutes to relax. Nothing says relaxation quite like receiving a notification reminding you to begin relaxing. The medieval clock didn't immediately create this world, of course. The transformation took centuries. Agricultural labour continued following seasonal rhythms long after mechanical clocks appeared. But something fundamental had begun. The day could increasingly be divided, standardised, measured, and eventually sold. And once time could be measured precisely, employers gained a powerful new way to organise labour. Your working life was no longer determined only by whether the day's task had been completed. It could be determined by whether enough hours had passed. The medieval peasant still lived partly by the sun. His descendants would increasingly live by the clock. And then factories arrived. At which point the clock stopped being helpful information on a tower. It became your boss. Once the clock begins organising your day, the next transformation becomes much easier. The factory. Imagine that you've left your agricultural village behind and entered the rapidly industrialising world of the 18th or 19th century. Your grandfather's working life depended heavily on seasons. Yours increasingly depends on a machine. And machines have one particularly annoying characteristic. They don't care that it's a beautiful summer afternoon. Inside a factory, work can continue according to schedules that have little connection with the natural world outside. Production requires workers to arrive at particular times, coordinate with one another, and remain at their stations for predetermined periods. Suddenly, being 10 minutes late matters much more. The wheat never filed a complaint when you arrived late. The factory supervisor might. Your work also becomes increasingly separated from your home. As a medieval peasant, you might have lived only a short walk from your fields. Household production, farming, family life and leisure frequently occupied the same small geographical world. Now you travel somewhere specifically to work. You enter, you work, you leave. In theory, that sounds like a clearer work-life boundary. In practice, early industrial labour could involve extraordinarily long hours, dangerous conditions, repetitive tasks, strict discipline, and schedules that would make your medieval harvest season look suspiciously familiar. Except harvest eventually ended. The factory opens again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. This is the crucial difference. Your medieval workload rises and falls. Industrial work becomes increasingly regular. Summer no longer automatically means longer agricultural days followed by winter slowdown. Artificial lighting makes darkness less important. Machinery determines the pace of production. Instead of adapting work to nature, you increasingly adapt yourself to work. Modern life inherits much of this structure. You probably don't hear a factory bell each morning, but your alarm performs essentially the same service with a more pleasant ringtone. You wake at a predetermined hour regardless of sunrise. You commute at a predetermined hour. You begin work at a predetermined hour. Then technology adds another twist. The factory once required you to physically enter the workplace. Your laptop allows the workplace to enter your bedroom. Humanity spent generations fighting for shorter working days, weekends, paid holidays, and safer conditions. Then we invented smartphones and quietly gave the office permission to live inside our pockets. Which brings us to the final comparison, because medieval peasants certainly worked hard. Industrial workers worked hard. You work differently. But perhaps the strangest feature of modern employment isn't how many hours you work. It's how difficult it has become to know when work has actually ended. After spending an imaginary year as a medieval peasant, you can finally answer the question: would you actually trade your modern working life for theirs? Probably not. Your medieval counterpart has no antibiotics, no electricity, no central heating, limited legal protections, uncertain food supplies, and a disturbingly high probability of discovering that a minor infection has become a major life event. You have supermarkets. He has winter. It's not a particularly fair competition. And yet when you focus specifically on the relationship between work and leisure, the comparison becomes much more interesting. Your medieval peasant can work brutally hard. Harvest demands exhausting days. Household labour never completely disappears. The Lord may demand services or payments. Women often carry an especially heavy combination of agricultural and domestic responsibilities, but medieval work also contains natural boundaries. The sun sets, winter arrives, Sunday comes, a feast day interrupts the week. The harvest eventually finishes. Your modern working life has eliminated many of those boundaries. You can work after sunset because you have electricity. You can work through winter because your office is heated. You can work from home because you have a laptop. You can answer your employer from almost anywhere because you have a smartphone. Technology has given you extraordinary freedom, including the freedom to receive a work email while sitting on a beach. Your medieval peasant would probably stare at your phone in amazement. Then you would explain that this miraculous object allows your boss to contact you during dinner, track your appointments, remind you about deadlines, and occasionally wake you with notifications. He might hand it back. Perhaps the real lesson isn't that medieval peasants had objectively better lives. They didn't. It's that progress doesn't automatically create rest. When technology saves you an hour, society can choose to give you that hour back. Or it can simply find another hour's worth of work. And modern life has become remarkably good at the second option. So perhaps medieval work-life balance wasn't better, because medieval people understood some secret philosophy of relaxation. Much of it existed because their world imposed limits that technology had not yet removed. Darkness meant something. Distance meant something. Seasons meant something. Being unavailable was normal, because there was literally no way to reach you. Today, you have to create those boundaries yourself. You have to close the laptop, silence the notifications, ignore the email, actually take the day off. Which means that after centuries of technological progress, you have somehow inherited a responsibility your medieval ancestor never had. You must personally tell work when the working day is over. And somewhere in the 13th century, a peasant is already asleep. His inbox remains beautifully empty. Imagine arriving at a wealthy Roman household for dinner. You have dressed properly, greeted the host, admired his suspiciously expensive marble decorations, and tried not to stare at the enslaved servants carrying trays around the room. Then you enter the dining room and discover something unusual. There are barely any dining chairs. Instead, your host expects you to lie down. For wealthy Romans, reclining during a formal meal became one of the most recognizable parts of elite dining culture. Guests stretched themselves across cushioned couches, usually leaning on the left elbow while keeping the right hand free for eating. From our perspective, it looks remarkably similar to eating snacks on the sofa while watching television. In Rome, however, doing essentially the same thing could demonstrate wealth, refinement, and social importance. The Romans had not invented the practice. Reclining at banquets had earlier traditions in the Greek world, and Roman elites adopted the custom as their society absorbed Greek cultural influences. Eventually, the dining couch became closely associated with respectable upper-class entertainment. And that distinction mattered. Ordinary Romans did not spend every meal dramatically reclining beside bowls of olives. Workers, soldiers, travellers, poorer families, and people grabbing food from shops or street vendors commonly ate in much simpler circumstances. Sitting on stools or benches, standing or eating quickly, was perfectly normal. Reclining was especially associated with the formal dinner, known as the cena. A wealthy household might have a dedicated dining room called a triclinium. Traditionally, couches were arranged around 3 sides of the dining area, leaving space for servants to approach and deliver food. Guests could eat, drink, talk, listen to entertainment, and quietly calculate whether the man reclining beside them was socially important enough to laugh at his terrible joke. Because a Roman banquet was never just about hunger, it was a performance. Your position, your clothing, the food being served, the people invited, and even where you reclined could reveal something about your place in society. The host was not merely feeding people. He was displaying his household, connections, generosity, and wealth. So when a Roman aristocrat lowered himself onto a dining couch, he was doing more than getting comfortable. He was making a statement. And once everyone had found their proper place, another problem appeared. Where exactly were you supposed to recline? Once you had mastered the basic skill of eating while lying sideways without pouring wine directly onto yourself, Roman dining presented another challenge. You had to recline in the correct place. In wealthy Roman homes, formal dinners often took place in a dining room known as the triclinium. The name itself came from the traditional arrangement of 3 dining couches positioned around a central table or tables. Rather than sitting around all 4 sides like a modern family dinner, guests reclined along these couches, while servants could move through the remaining open space. It looked comfortable. Socially, however, it could be surprisingly complicated. A Roman dinner party was not necessarily a gathering where everyone was treated equally. Roman society was deeply concerned with rank, reputation, wealth, political influence, family connections, and patronage. Those distinctions did not magically disappear because somebody brought out the wine. They followed you directly onto the couch. Certain positions could be considered more prestigious than others, and the arrangement of guests could reflect their relationship with the host. An important political ally, respected guest, or powerful patron might receive an honoured position. Someone less significant could find himself occupying a less desirable place. Imagine attending dinner and discovering that the seating arrangement has essentially informed everyone how important your host thinks you are. Wonderful. You have not even reached the appetizers, and your evening already contains a performance review. Traditionally, diners reclined on their left sides, allowing their right hands to remain available for taking food. Several guests might share the same couch, meaning dinner involved a surprisingly intimate amount of lounging beside acquaintances. The couches themselves could also demonstrate wealth. Elite dining rooms might contain decorated furniture, cushions, fine fabrics, painted walls, mosaics, lamps, and expensive tableware. Everything helped create the impression that the household possessed money, taste, and enough servants to ensure the owner rarely had to stand up unnecessarily. The dining room therefore became something like a stage. The host controlled the guest list. He controlled the food. He controlled the entertainment. And, to a considerable extent, he controlled the social geography of the room. You were not simply eating inside his house. You were participating in a carefully organized display of Roman hierarchy. And once everyone had been arranged according to importance, the host could begin the next part of the performance, proving exactly how much food he could afford to put in front of them. Once everyone had been arranged on the correct couch, the real Roman dinner could begin. And if you were expecting a quiet meal followed by everyone politely going home, you had seriously underestimated wealthy Romans. A formal banquet was entertainment, networking, status competition, and dinner all happening at once. For an ambitious Roman, inviting people to dine could strengthen friendships, reward supporters, impress potential allies, and remind everyone that you were doing extremely well financially. The food mattered, obviously, but what the food represented could matter even more. A modest meal might include bread, vegetables, olives, cheese, eggs, fish, and wine. Wealthier hosts could go considerably further. Multiple courses might appear, featuring expensive seafood, elaborate meat dishes, imported ingredients, sauces, fruits, pastries, and other delicacies. The important thing was abundance. If your guests left thinking, "That man clearly spent far too much money feeding us," you had potentially succeeded. And naturally, wealthy Romans found ways to turn eating into competition. Elite writers occasionally describe extravagant banquets, where hosts displayed rare or costly foods simply because they could. Exotic ingredients demonstrated access to the enormous trade networks of the Roman world. Something arriving from a distant province carried more than flavour, it carried prestige. Your dinner was effectively announcing that the empire had been searched for ingredients, because ordinary chicken had become emotionally insufficient. But guests were not expected merely to chew silently. Conversation was central to the experience. Politics, literature, gossip, business, philosophy, poetry, and scandal could all circulate through the room alongside the wine. Depending on the household, entertainment might include musicians, singers, dancers, poetry readings, or other performers. Meanwhile, servants moved between the reclining guests, bringing dishes, filling cups, removing leftovers, and keeping the entire performance running. And this reveals something important about reclining itself. Lying down made sense precisely because elite dinner was supposed to take time. You were not eating quickly before returning to work. You were demonstrating that you had leisure. You could spend hours drinking, talking, eating slowly, and allowing other people to handle practically everything around you. Time itself became part of the luxury. The ordinary labourer needed dinner. The wealthy Roman could afford an evening. But underneath all that comfortable reclining was a much less comfortable reality, because the leisure enjoyed on those couches depended heavily on the people who remained standing. The comfortable world of Roman reclining becomes rather less relaxing when you look at the people surrounding the couches. While wealthy guests stretched across cushions, drank wine, debated politics, and considered whether they had room for another course, someone else had to make the entire evening possible. Usually, many people. Elite Roman households could contain numerous enslaved workers responsible for preparing and serving meals. Some cooked in kitchens away from the dining room. Others carried dishes, poured wine, cleaned tables, collected discarded food, provided towels or water, and remained nearby waiting for instructions. So while the guests were demonstrating their freedom from work, servants were demonstrating the exact opposite. That contrast was part of what made reclining meaningful. Think about the position itself. Eating while lying sideways is not particularly efficient. If you have 15 minutes before returning to work, you probably do not arrange yourself elegantly on cushions and wait for someone to bring you several courses. You sit down, or stand, or eat while moving. Reclining communicated that you had time. More importantly, it suggested that other people were available to do the moving for you. A wealthy Roman guest did not necessarily need to walk into the kitchen, collect his meal, refill his drink, or clear away his plate. Food could simply appear beside him while he remained comfortably positioned on the couch. This transformed physical inactivity into a subtle display of privilege. Even the banquet room reinforced the distinction. Guests occupied the couches while attendants circulated through the open spaces around them. One group remained relatively still, the other constantly moved, and Roman literature suggests that treatment of enslaved servants could vary enormously between households. Some elite Romans criticized masters who behaved cruelly towards servants during dinner, while other accounts reveal precisely the kind of humiliation and punishment that could exist inside wealthy homes. The beautiful banquet, therefore, had an uncomfortable foundation. The polished cups, expensive dishes, soft cushions, and leisurely conversations depended on labour that elite guests were specifically demonstrating they did not have to perform themselves. Reclining was comfortable, certainly, but comfort itself carried social meaning. You could afford to spend hours horizontal because somebody else was standing. And once that distinction between leisure and labour became established, Roman dining culture developed another complicated question. Who exactly was allowed onto those couches in the first place? Once reclining became associated with respectable Roman dining, another question appeared. Who actually got to do it? Because Rome being Rome, the answer was not simply everyone at dinner. Dining customs changed over the centuries, and practices differed between households, regions, and social groups. But in traditional elite Roman culture, reclining was strongly associated with adult male citizens and formal social status. The dining couch was not just furniture. It could represent your position inside the household and society. Women present an especially interesting case. Earlier Roman traditions were more restrictive about respectable women reclining alongside men at banquets. Literary sources suggest that women might sit while men reclined, reflecting older ideas about modesty and proper behaviour. But Roman customs were not frozen in time. By the late Republic, and especially during the imperial period, elite women could recline at dinner as well. Roman society had changed, and the image of men lounging magnificently while their wives sat upright like disappointed schoolteachers became less universal. Children could also be treated differently depending on age and circumstance, sometimes sitting rather than reclining with adults. And then there was everyone outside the elite world. Most Romans were not spending every evening inside luxurious triclinia. The empire contained farmers, craftspeople, merchants, dock workers, soldiers, labourers, shopkeepers, enslaved people, freed people, and countless others whose daily meals were considerably less theatrical. Many ate sitting normally, others ate standing, especially when purchasing prepared food away from home. Archaeological remains of Roman food establishments help remind us how different ordinary dining could be. Counters containing large vessels for food and drink suggest a world far removed from the leisurely banquet couch. You might stop somewhere, purchase something warm, eat quickly, and continue with your day. Very sophisticated. Unfortunately, no cushions. This is why saying Romans ate lying down is slightly misleading. Some Romans did, and the Romans most likely to appear in surviving literature and luxurious artwork were precisely the people wealthy enough to make reclining fashionable. The couch therefore represented something larger than an unusual eating position. It separated formal leisure from ordinary necessity. To recline was to participate in a particular version of Roman life, comfortable, social, hierarchical, and deliberately impressive. But there remains one practical question. After several courses and several cups of wine, was eating while lying sideways actually comfortable? Because Roman sophistication still had to negotiate with the human stomach. After several chapters of Roman dining etiquette, we finally reach the obvious question. Was eating while lying down actually comfortable? Surprisingly, it probably could be. Roman diners were not usually lying completely flat like someone attempting to eat dinner without leaving bed. Instead, they reclined diagonally on cushioned couches, supporting the upper body on the left elbow, while keeping the right hand available for eating. Once you became accustomed to the position, it allowed you to relax for a long meal. And long meals were exactly the point. An elite Roman banquet could continue through multiple courses, conversations, drinking, entertainment, and socializing. Sitting rigidly upright was unnecessary when the evening might continue for hours. Reclining allowed guests to settle into their surroundings. Of course, Roman food also helped. Much of it could be eaten using the fingers, although spoons and other utensils were available. Food might be prepared or cut into manageable portions before reaching the diner. You were therefore not expected to balance an enormous steak on your chest while attacking it with a knife. That would have slightly damaged the atmosphere. Servants could bring dishes within easy reach, refill wine, remove unwanted food, and keep everything moving while the guests remained comfortably horizontal. But reclining was never purely about comfort. That is what makes the custom so revealing. A chair would have worked perfectly well. Romans knew chairs existed. They had stools, benches, seats, and plenty of opportunities to eat upright. The dining couch survived among the elite because it transformed dinner into something more than simply consuming calories. It communicated leisure. You had enough time to recline. You had enough space for a dedicated dining room. You could afford couches and cushions. And perhaps most importantly, you had other people available to bring everything to you. So the next time you see a Roman banquet depicted with wealthy citizens stretched across couches, remember that you are looking at an entire social system expressed through furniture. The couches revealed hierarchy. The banquet displayed wealth. The guest list demonstrated connections. The servants represented labour, and reclining tied everything together. Eventually, Roman dining customs changed, and the classical triclinium would not remain the dominant model forever. But for centuries, among certain sections of Roman society, lying down to dinner was one of the clearest ways of announcing that this was not merely a meal. This was leisure. This was status. This was Rome. And apparently, sitting normally simply wasn't sophisticated enough. If you could visit an ordinary household several centuries ago, one of the first differences you might notice would be the absence of something you probably used this morning. A shower. There is no faucet to turn, no endless supply of hot water, and certainly no collection of shampoos promising to make your hair smell like tropical fruit. Yet this does not mean everyone simply accepted being filthy. The real difference was that people often had a completely different idea of what being clean actually meant. Today, cleanliness is closely connected with bathing the entire body. For many of us, going a day or two without showering already feels questionable. Historically, however, washing could be much more selective. You might wash your face in the morning. You might clean your hands before eating. You could wipe your neck, arms, or other exposed areas using water and cloth. Your hair might be combed carefully, and your clothing changed whenever circumstances allowed. And after doing all of this, you could reasonably consider yourself clean without ever climbing into a bathtub. There was also an extremely practical reason for this. Water was heavy. Before modern plumbing, every bucket used for bathing had to come from somewhere. It might need to be collected from a well, fountain, river, cistern, or communal water source, and physically carried home. If you wanted that water warm, someone then had to heat it. Now imagine filling an entire bathtub this way. Suddenly, washing your face with a basin starts looking remarkably sensible. Wealth mattered enormously. A rich household could employ servants to carry and heat water. Poorer families had to consider whether spending enormous effort preparing a bath was really necessary when smaller amounts of water could accomplish basic washing. But bathing habits also changed dramatically, depending on where and when you lived. A Roman living near an enormous public bath complex experienced cleanliness very differently from someone living in a rural medieval village. Religious beliefs, medical theories, local customs, climate, infrastructure, and even fears about disease could influence how people treated their bodies. So the popular image of everyone before modern plumbing wandering around permanently covered in dirt is far too simple. People washed, they cleaned clothing, they groomed themselves, they cared about unpleasant smells. They simply did not always believe cleanliness required regularly immersing the entire body in water. And nowhere is that difference clearer than in the ancient world, where bathing could become something much larger than hygiene. It could become an entire social event. That larger social event reached perhaps its most famous form in the Roman world, where taking a bath could involve considerably more than getting clean. Imagine finishing your work and heading toward a public bathhouse. You are not necessarily carrying soap, shampoo, conditioner, and 12 products whose purpose nobody fully understands. Instead, you are entering one of the great social spaces of Roman daily life. Roman towns and cities could contain public bathing establishments ranging from relatively modest neighbourhood facilities to enormous complexes. The grandest included heated rooms, warm pools, cold baths, exercise areas, gardens, and spaces where people could meet and relax. Bathing was only part of the experience. You might exercise first, covering yourself in sweat and dust. Oil could be rubbed onto the skin, after which dirt, perspiration, and excess oil were scraped away using a curved instrument called a strigil. It sounds slightly less relaxing than modern shower gel, but it worked within Roman ideas about bodily care. Afterward, bathers could move through rooms maintained at different temperatures. The caldarium provided a hot environment, the tepidarium offered warmth, and the frigidarium provided cold water. Roman bathhouses could use sophisticated heating systems, particularly the hypocaust, which circulated hot air beneath floors and sometimes through wall spaces. For people without private bathing facilities, public baths offered access to something extraordinarily valuable: large quantities of heated water. But the baths were also places to socialize. Romans could meet acquaintances, discuss business, exercise, relax, hear gossip, and spend part of the day among other people. Depending on the establishment, additional services and entertainment might be available nearby. Naturally, Roman baths should not be mistaken for perfectly sterile modern swimming pools. Large numbers of people shared facilities, ancient sanitation had obvious limitations, and the Romans knew nothing about germ theory. Their impressive engineering could move enormous quantities of water without giving them any understanding of microscopic pathogens. Still, the important point is that Romans clearly did not consider avoiding water an essential part of cleanliness. Quite the opposite. Bathing became deeply embedded in Roman urban culture. And that makes what happened later particularly interesting, because Europe did not simply progress smoothly from Roman bathhouses toward the modern bathroom. Public bathing traditions changed. Infrastructure declined in many places. Medical and religious attitudes evolved. And eventually, some Europeans would become suspicious of the very thing Romans had embraced so enthusiastically: putting your entire body into water. When Roman political authority weakened in Western Europe, the enormous bathing culture of the empire changed with it. Aqueducts deteriorated in some places, urban populations declined, and maintaining gigantic heated bath complexes became considerably more difficult. But this did not mean medieval Europeans suddenly looked at water and decided they had enjoyed enough cleanliness for one civilization. People continued bathing. In many medieval towns, public bathhouses still existed. Depending on the place and period, these establishments could provide wooden tubs filled with heated water, steam bathing, food, conversation, and sometimes entertainment that had very little to do with removing dirt. Bathing could still be social. A customer might enter a bathhouse, remove their clothing, climb into a large wooden tub, and spend considerable time soaking. Some images even show people eating and drinking while bathing. Apparently, medieval people occasionally discovered the dangerous idea that almost every activity becomes more enjoyable when somebody brings snacks. Private bathing also existed. Wealthy households could have large tubs prepared inside their homes. Servants carried water, heated it, filled the container, and later faced the deeply glamorous task of removing all that water again. For poorer people, things were less convenient. A complete bath required fuel, water, time, containers, and privacy. Heating enough water to fill a tub could consume valuable firewood. Carrying it could require repeated journeys. Consequently, everyday cleanliness often relied on smaller-scale washing. Hands were particularly important. Medieval dining frequently involved touching food directly, making hand-washing before and after meals a recognized practice in respectable households. Faces could be washed, hair combed, and exposed parts of the body cleaned using basins and cloths. So medieval hygiene was not simply a choice between taking a modern-style bath and doing absolutely nothing. There were many levels in between, and attitudes differed enormously across medieval Europe. Customs in one century, region, religious community, or social class should not automatically be applied to everyone else. This becomes important because the stereotype of the permanently filthy medieval person usually compresses roughly 1,000 years of history into one extremely smelly afternoon. The reality was much more complicated. In fact, the dramatic suspicion surrounding full-body bathing became especially important during later centuries, when changing medical theories and outbreaks of disease encouraged some Europeans to reconsider whether entering warm water was actually healthy. And according to certain physicians, your freshly opened pores were about to become a serious problem. The medieval bathhouse had survived, but attitudes toward bathing would not remain unchanged forever. By the late medieval and early modern periods, Europeans repeatedly faced devastating outbreaks of disease. Physicians had no knowledge of bacteria or viruses, so they explained illness using the medical theories available to them. And unfortunately for anyone hoping for a relaxing bath, warm water eventually became suspicious. One influential fear involved the pores of the skin. People understood that heat caused the body to sweat, and medical writers could reason that warm baths opened the pores. According to theories circulating at the time, this potentially left the body vulnerable to dangerous outside influences. Disease was often associated with corrupted or poisonous air, commonly described through ideas that historians now connect with miasma theory. If harmful air could enter the body, then opening your pores in a steaming bath suddenly seemed like an unnecessarily generous invitation. Imagine being told that your bath has opened thousands of tiny doors through which disease might enter. You might reconsider staying dirty for another day. The fear became especially powerful during periods of epidemic disease. Public bathhouses brought many people together in enclosed environments, creating additional reasons for authorities and individuals to distrust them. Some bathhouses also developed reputations for drinking, prostitution, and disorder. Concerns about morality therefore became mixed together with concerns about health. The result was not that everyone immediately stopped washing. Instead, ideas about cleanliness began shifting. Rather than frequently immersing the entire body, some people increasingly emphasized washing selected areas, grooming the hair, keeping visible skin clean, and wearing fresh linen. Linen became especially important among Europeans, who could afford enough clothing to change it regularly. Shirts and undergarments absorbed sweat and oils from the body. Changing these garments could therefore become part of what it meant to feel clean. From a modern perspective, replacing your shirt instead of taking a shower might sound like trying to solve a plumbing problem with additional laundry. But within contemporary ideas about health, it could make sense. people were not deliberately choosing dirtiness. They were trying to remain healthy according to the medical knowledge available to them. And that distinction matters. Historical hygiene was shaped not simply by laziness or lack of technology, but by changing beliefs about what water actually did to the human body. By the early modern period, this could produce a strange situation. A respectable person might care deeply about cleanliness while avoiding frequent full-body immersion. And if water was becoming questionable, Europeans needed another way to convince everyone that they were clean. The answer was increasingly something you could see immediately: clean clothing. Once frequent full-body bathing became suspicious in some parts of Europe, cleanliness did not disappear. It simply changed clothes. Literally. During the early modern period, especially among people who could afford enough clothing, fresh linen became an important sign that someone was clean and respectable. Shirts, shifts, collars, cuffs, and undergarments sat directly against the skin, absorbing sweat, oils, and dirt throughout the day. Instead of washing the entire body constantly, you could change the layer touching it. To modern eyes, this sounds slightly questionable. Imagine finishing an intense summer afternoon, deciding that a shower would be unnecessarily dangerous, and simply putting on another shirt. Problem solved, or at least temporarily relocated. But within contemporary ideas about hygiene, clean linen made considerable sense. Clothing could physically remove some sweat and grime from the skin when changed. Meanwhile, visible white linen communicated something else. You had enough resources to own multiple garments and keep them washed. Cleanliness, therefore, became connected with social status. A wealthy person might change linen frequently, while poorer people had fewer garments and fewer opportunities to wash them. Maintaining bright white fabric required labour, water, soap or other cleaning materials, drying space and time. Someone had to do all that washing. Usually, it was not the aristocrat proudly wearing the result. People still washed parts of their bodies as well. Hands and faces received particular attention because they remained visible. Cloths and basins could be used for more extensive cleaning without requiring complete immersion in a tub. Hair could be combed and groomed carefully. Combs helped remove dirt and could also assist with one extremely persistent historical problem: lice. Perfumes and scented preparations also became associated with personal presentation, especially among elites. But perfume should not simply be imagined as medieval air freshener desperately attempting to defeat several months without water. People used fragrances because pleasant scents were fashionable, and because smell itself could be connected with contemporary ideas about health. The result was a definition of cleanliness that might seem strange today. You could have freshly washed hands, a carefully cleaned face, combed hair, immaculate white linen, and an expensive fragrance while still not having taken what we would recognise as a proper full-body bath. And society might consider you perfectly respectable. But eventually, another change was coming. Doctors, scientists, engineers, and urban reformers would begin reconsidering dirt, disease, and water itself. And once people discovered what was actually hiding in contaminated water and filthy environments, hygiene would never look quite the same again. For centuries, people had tried to stay healthy using the explanations available to them. Bad smells were suspicious. Fresh air seemed healthy. Clean linen felt respectable, and avoiding a steaming bath could occasionally appear medically sensible. Then science began making the situation considerably more complicated. During the 18th and especially 19th centuries, researchers and physicians gradually developed better explanations for disease. One of the most important changes came from understanding that illnesses could spread through contaminated environments and eventually through microorganisms invisible to the naked eye. This transformed hygiene. Suddenly, dirt was not merely unpleasant, it could be dangerous. The development of germ theory during the 19th century helped overturn older explanations that blamed disease primarily on poisonous air. Scientists, including Louis Pasteur, demonstrated the importance of microorganisms, while medical figures such as Joseph Lister applied antiseptic principles to surgery. But another enormous change was happening outside laboratories. Cities were growing. Industrialization brought huge populations into increasingly crowded urban neighborhoods. Houses could be packed together, streets were busy, and sewage disposal was often inadequate. Human waste sometimes contaminated wells and other water supplies. Cholera made the consequences terrifyingly obvious. During 19th century outbreaks, thousands could become sick in rapidly spreading epidemics. In London, physician John Snow famously investigated an outbreak in Soho in 1854 and connected cases with water from the Broad Street pump. The realization that contaminated water could transmit disease helped transform attitudes toward sanitation. Now, governments had powerful reasons to build sewers, improve drainage, protect drinking water, and create more reliable urban water systems. And once clean water became easier to deliver into homes, bathing itself became easier. Remember the problem faced by earlier households. Every bucket had to be carried. Every large quantity of bath water might need to be heated manually. Modern plumbing gradually removed that enormous inconvenience. At first, these improvements were uneven. Wealthy households benefited earlier, while poorer urban families could continue relying on shared pumps, communal facilities, public bathhouses, or limited water supplies. But the direction was changing. Cleanliness was increasingly connected not merely with appearance or respectable clothing, but with disease prevention. Washing the body became easier to justify medically. Washing hands became increasingly important. Clean water became a public health priority. And slowly, the bathroom began moving from an occasional luxury toward an expected feature of everyday life. Still, one final ingredient was needed before bathing could begin resembling your morning routine. Someone had to make hot running water conveniently appear inside ordinary homes. Imagine beginning a long journey without knowing where you will sleep tonight. There is no hotel reservation waiting for you, no reception desk, no private bathroom, no little card explaining that breakfast ends at 10. You simply leave home, follow the road, and hope that before darkness arrives, you find somewhere reasonably warm, reasonably dry, and preferably occupied by people who have no interest in stealing your belongings. For most of history, long-distance travel required this kind of uncertainty. People travelled for trade, pilgrimage, military service, government business, seasonal work, education, religious duties, and family matters. Some travelled on horseback or in carts, but enormous numbers simply walked. And walking made distance feel very different. A journey that takes 2 hours by car today might require several days on foot. Weather could slow you down. Roads could become muddy. Rivers could become difficult to cross. A damaged bridge might force a detour. Then evening arrived. Now you needed shelter. Experienced travellers planned routes around towns, villages, religious houses, established inns, and other places where accommodation might be available. But there was rarely a guarantee that you would receive anything resembling a private room. Sometimes you might find an inn. Sometimes a monastery or religious institution might offer hospitality, particularly to pilgrims and certain travellers. Sometimes you depended on private households, and sometimes your accommodation was simply whatever protected you from the weather. Hospitality therefore mattered enormously. In societies where commercial accommodation was limited, Traditions of welcoming travellers could create an informal network of shelter. Connections helped too. A merchant carrying letters of introduction, or someone travelling between communities where he knew people had advantages over the unfortunate stranger, arriving after sunset with nothing except tired feet and optimism. But even finding accommodation did not mean finding comfort. Beds could be shared, rooms could be crowded, privacy was limited, animals might be nearby, fleas and lice were possibilities, and your fellow travellers were complete strangers. You might fall asleep beside a merchant, a pilgrim, a soldier, a labourer, or someone whose occupation remained suspiciously unclear. And your possessions? Keep them close. Travellers worried about theft for good reason, especially when sleeping among strangers. Yet millions of journeys were completed this way. Travel was not impossible without hotels. It simply required accepting uncertainty as part of the road. And when a weary traveller finally spotted an inn ahead, the next challenge began. Because a historical inn was not necessarily the cosy roadside hotel you might be imagining. That inn appearing beside the road might have looked like salvation after a long day of walking. You see light through the windows, hear voices inside, and perhaps smell food cooking. Your feet hurt, your clothes are dusty, and suddenly even the least impressive building in Europe looks like a luxury resort. Then you walk inside. Historical inns varied enormously depending on region, period, and location, but many were designed around practical needs rather than privacy. Travellers needed food, drink, shelter, and somewhere for their horses or animals. Comfort came somewhere further down the list. An innkeeper might provide a meal based on whatever was available locally: bread, cheese, pottage, meat, fish, eggs, or ale and wine. You were unlikely to receive a menu containing 30 carefully photographed options. You ate what existed. Accommodation could be equally straightforward. Private bedrooms were not guaranteed. Several travellers might sleep in the same room, and beds themselves could sometimes be shared. Personal space was not understood in quite the same way we expect today. Imagine checking into your accommodation and discovering that another traveller has already occupied half your mattress. No problem. Apparently, you have been upgraded to networking. Straw mattresses, simple bedding, benches, floors, or communal sleeping spaces could all become possibilities depending on the establishment and how much money you possessed. Then there were the smells. Travellers arrived after spending hours walking or riding. Horses and other animals might be kept nearby. Fires produced smoke. Food was cooking. Ale was being spilled. Boots were muddy. Your historical inn was probably not competing for 5 stars, but inns offered something enormously important: security. Sleeping completely alone beside a road exposed travellers to weather, animals, theft, and violence. An occupied building provided walls, a roof, warmth, information, and other people. Those people could also be useful. Travellers exchanged news about road conditions, dangerous areas, river crossings, markets, political trouble, and places to stay further ahead. An inn could function as an information centre long before anyone could check conditions on a phone. Of course, your fellow guests could also be the exact people you were hoping to avoid, which created one of the great contradictions of historical travel. Strangers made the road safer. Strangers also made the road dangerous. And if you preferred something slightly quieter and perhaps more respectable, another institution offered travellers shelter across enormous stretches of Europe. The monastery. If the crowded inn did not appeal to you, another possibility could offer something rather different: a monastery. Across medieval Europe, monasteries and other religious institutions became important stopping places for travellers, especially pilgrims. Hospitality toward strangers had deep roots in Christian teaching, and many religious communities treated welcoming certain travelers as part of their religious responsibilities. For someone exhausted after a day on the road, seeing a monastery could therefore be extremely reassuring. You might receive shelter, basic food, water, and somewhere to sleep. Nothing about this promised luxury. You were entering a religious community, not an early version of an all-inclusive resort. Accommodation could be simple, sometimes provided in a guest house associated with the monastery, rather than among the monks themselves. Larger or wealthier institutions could maintain dedicated facilities for visitors, while poorer establishments naturally had fewer resources. Your treatment might also depend on who you were. A wealthy nobleman, important churchman, ordinary pilgrim, and impoverished traveller could receive very different accommodation. Medieval hospitality existed within a deeply hierarchical society, and apparently even Christian charity occasionally came with different room categories. Still, monasteries offered something particularly valuable: reliability. Important pilgrimage routes carried streams of travellers toward religious destinations. Monasteries, hospices, churches, and charitable institutions helped create networks where pilgrims could find assistance along the way. Some religious houses were positioned in especially difficult landscapes. Mountain passes, remote roads, and isolated regions could make travel dangerous. Institutions providing shelter in such places were not merely offering convenience. During bad weather, reaching one could genuinely protect a traveller from exposure. And travellers needed more than beds. They might require food, directions, information about the road ahead, medical assistance, or help recovering from exhaustion. Religious hospitality could provide a temporary place to regain strength before continuing. But monasteries had rules. You were entering an organised community built around prayer and discipline. The atmosphere was very different from an inn filled with drinking, gambling, arguments, and someone loudly explaining why his horse was definitely faster than yours. For many travellers, that difference was probably welcome. Yet monasteries could not appear beside every road. Eventually you might find yourself far from an inn, monastery, or town, while daylight disappeared behind you. And that was when an older and even more important system became necessary. You knocked on somebody's door and hoped they were feeling generous. If there was no inn ahead and no monastery nearby, you might have to rely on something far less predictable: a complete stranger. For much of history, hospitality was an important part of travel precisely because commercial accommodation was not available everywhere. Travellers passing through villages or remote countryside could ask local households for shelter, food, or simply permission to sleep somewhere protected from the weather. Naturally, this required trust from both sides. From your perspective, you were approaching an unfamiliar house after dark and asking people you had never met to let you inside. From their perspective, an unknown person had just appeared outside carrying a bag and explaining that he needed somewhere to sleep. Everybody was having an excellent evening. Hospitality customs varied enormously between cultures, regions, and periods. In many societies, religious and social traditions encouraged people to provide food or shelter to travellers. A guest might be offered a place near the fire, a bench, some straw, space on the floor, or occasionally a proper bed. Do not imagine a private guest bedroom with fresh towels waiting upstairs. The important thing was shelter. Connections could make this arrangement much easier. Travellers often carried letters of introduction or relied on networks of relatives, merchants, religious communities, professional contacts, and acquaintances. If someone trusted you because they knew your family, employer, monastery, guild, or business partner, suddenly you were less of a mysterious stranger standing outside their door. And travellers could repay hospitality. Money was one possibility, but payment could also come through gifts, food, news, assistance, or the expectation that hospitality would someday be returned. In communities where people regularly travelled, today's guest might become tomorrow's host. But accepting hospitality created risks. A traveller entering an unfamiliar household had little control over the situation. The host might be dishonest. The accommodation might be uncomfortable. Your possessions could disappear. The household faced exactly the same problem. Their guest might be the dangerous one. Historical travel therefore depended heavily on reputation and social trust. Knowing someone's name, occupation, destination, or connections could matter enormously. Still, when night was falling and rain was beginning, even the floor of a farmhouse could look magnificent, because the alternative might be sleeping outside. And whether you stayed in a private house, monastery, or roadside inn, one uncomfortable feature remained surprisingly common. You were probably going to sleep much closer to other people than you would ever choose today. Sleeping close to other people was not an unfortunate accident of historical travel. It was often completely normal. Today, booking accommodation usually means expecting your own room and your own bed. If you opened your hotel door and discovered 3 merchants already asleep beneath your blanket, you would probably return immediately to reception. Historically, you might simply ask which side was yours. Space was valuable. Beds were expensive pieces of furniture, and inns needed to accommodate travellers with limited rooms. Sharing sleeping spaces therefore made practical sense. Several guests might occupy the same chamber. In some circumstances, travellers could even share the same bed with people they barely knew, and these beds were not necessarily small. Large beds could accommodate multiple sleepers, while cheaper guests might settle for straw mattresses, benches, or space on the floor. At especially crowded establishments, your definition of acceptable accommodation could become remarkably flexible. Privacy was minimal. You could hear people snoring. You could smell people who had spent the entire day travelling. Someone might arrive late. Someone else might leave before sunrise. And somewhere in the darkness, one traveller was almost certainly producing noises nobody wanted explained. Then there were insects. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were familiar problems in historical sleeping environments. Bedding was difficult to maintain according to modern standards, especially in busy establishments constantly receiving travellers. Your mysterious roommate might therefore not be the only thing joining you in bed. But the greatest concern was often theft. Travellers carried money, documents, clothing, merchandise, weapons, and personal possessions with them. Losing these items hundreds of miles from home could be disastrous. Experienced travellers therefore had reasons to keep valuables close while sleeping. Bags might remain beside the body, money could be concealed, and greater privacy could be worth paying for when available. Still, communal sleeping had advantages. There was safety in numbers. A crowded room provided witnesses and made certain kinds of attack more difficult. Fellow travellers could also become temporary companions for the next stage of the journey. You might meet someone heading toward the same town and decide to travel together. That could make the road safer. Or you might discover after 20 minutes that your new companion had extremely strong opinions about grain prices. There were risks either way, because surviving a historical journey was never simply about finding somewhere to sleep. The real challenge was waking up the next morning with your money, your possessions, your horse, and preferably the same number of limbs you had when you went to bed. If you woke the next morning with your money, belongings, horse, and dignity still reasonably intact, congratulations. You had successfully completed one night of historical travel. Now you only had to repeat the process until you reached your destination. This uncertainty explains why experienced travellers rarely treated a long journey casually. Survival depended on planning, information, social connections, and knowing when not to behave like the adventurous hero of your own story. Travelling with others was one of the simplest protections. Merchants could join caravans or travel together. Pilgrims often moved in groups. Soldiers, messengers and officials might have companions. Even strangers heading toward the same destination could temporarily cooperate. A group offered protection against robbery and provided help if someone became injured or ill. Routes mattered too. Experienced travellers learned where reliable inns, villages, bridges, monasteries, wells and towns could be found. Major pilgrimage and commercial routes developed networks of services precisely because travellers repeatedly passed through them. Information was extremely valuable. At an inn, you might ask whether a bridge ahead had been damaged, whether a road was safe, where the next lodging could be found, or whether recent weather had made a particular route difficult. The medieval equivalent of checking traffic conditions was asking a man drinking ale whether the northern road was still technically a road. Money also changed everything. Wealthier travellers could afford horses, servants, better food, safer rooms, and private accommodation when available. Elite travellers might stay with aristocratic contacts or religious institutions and carry letters that opened doors unavailable to ordinary strangers. Poor travellers depended more heavily on charity, inexpensive lodging, communal sleeping, and whatever shelter happened to be available. Yet across all these social levels, historical travel relied on something modern travellers often barely notice: networks of human hospitality. There was no enormous standardised hotel industry covering every route. Instead, travellers moved through overlapping systems of inns, monasteries, hospices, private households, relatives, professional contacts, religious communities, and roadside settlements. A journey was therefore partly a chain of small negotiations. Where can I sleep? What will it cost? Can I trust you? Can you trust me? And where should I go tomorrow? Long-distance travel was slower, less private, and considerably less predictable than it is today. But people still crossed kingdoms, mountains, deserts, and continents. They simply learned to accept something modern travellers generally try very hard to avoid: not knowing exactly where they would sleep that night.